Shall we play a game? In 1983, that line from the movie War Games was science fiction. Today, on January 30th, 2026, it is the standard operating procedure of the United States military. We are no longer just fighting for land or oil, we are fighting for the code that controls them. Welcome to the premiere of the King Exchange. I'm Sean. Joining us today, a very special guest, Steve. Steve is an IT professional with 25 years plus experience and a successful business owner who has spent years analyzing the Internet of Things, the hidden web connecting our appliances, our cars, and most importantly, our power grids. Steve, you've spoken to the IT director of the Panama Canal and are on top of AI developments and phenomena. Welcome to the show. And we're also joined by Kellen Clark, Operations Director at J&Washington, an aspiring lawyer and University of Central Florida graduate in advertising and public relations. Kellen is driven by a singular mission to reconnect the public with their government. He operates on the belief that effective policy begins with effective communication. At J&Washington, he translates this passion into action, expanding public resources and sharpening outreach strategies for office holders and candidates. And again, I am Sean King, your Media Network Director and host of the King Exchange. January 3rd, Operation Absolute Resolve. U.S. forces capture Maduro and Caracas. But the real story wasn't the extraction, it was how the lights went out. Reports confirm a Stuxnet-style virus disabled the Venezuelan air defense and the city's power grid simultaneously. So, Steve, welcome to the show. You've analyzed how tactical power outages work. People think of a bomb hitting a transformer, but you say it's about the ICS, Industrial Control Systems. How does a virus like Stuxnet turn off the lights without firing a shot? And first of all, what even is Stuxnet? And give me sort of context and background to how that relates to Venezuela.
Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity to discuss this. So Stuxnet was a virus that was developed in the early 2000s to compromise the Iranian centrifuge. And it wasn't discovered until the 2010s or 2010, somewhere around there. And basically that virus was the first ever worm really to attack industrial control systems. Industrial control systems are in pretty much everything that relies on automation or like power plants, for example, utilities, water. So basically water, electric, sewer systems, supply chain management for food, you name it. And the virus infects these systems, not in a way where you would think a virus would normally like damage your computer or be detected, so to speak. It sits there quietly, and it reaches out to a command and control server, which whoever is in control of that virus, and where that person can give commands or set timers or change variables, so such as remote switches to turn on and off, or temperature reporting. So let's say the systems are overheating, it could report that they're not overheating, that they're normally functioning fine, and the operator of that utility would not even know that was in there. So those industrial control systems, such as the ones that control the power grid, are accessed usually remotely, connected to the internet, usually for service technicians or to connect to other parts of the grid, to report, to their other plants. So for example, the United States, we buy power from Canada. Our grid connects to Canada, and those grids have to communicate to each other for demand meets. So if we need more demand in energy, let's say in New York City, we might have that power grid in the United States reach out and say, hey, look, I need some more power. And it's all connected through the internet or private networks. So when you have a virus like Stuxnet, and it's infected on a grid or one of the nodes or whatnot, it can be controlled by a malicious actor, so to speak. So that's pretty much Stuxnet, and it was used back in the early 2010s to destroy the Iranian centrifuge.
So when we're talking about War Games, that is a famous movie from 1983. How is that movie and the methods from that movie relevant to today? Are they still even relevant? And how does that connect to cyber warfare in Venezuela specifically?
A lot of people think, well, 1983 technology doesn't exist today, where you have to hear how we hear so on and so forth about our aging power grid and so on. It was built on that technology back in 1983, and it still exists today. So you can have systems connected to a phone line like War Games, where he was using a war dialer, calling random phone numbers to see if a computer picks up. Well, look towards today, and it's not just a phone number anymore, it's an IP address. So your computer, your laptop, everything we're on right now has an IP address that's connected to a public IP address, which is accessible from the internet. So someone could use a similar method, which back in the day it was a war dialer, which is still used today, to find a computer that will listen. Well, now it's to find an IP address that will listen, and then that IP address could be connected to a power plant or a fresh water system or a traffic light or anything that has an industrial control system. It could be, like I said, a supply chain management system of a factory. They all use the same systems, the PLC units. And so that method is still used today to get information to see who is this IP address, what data or what's happening to and from that IP address, and basically uh, that's how it's relevant to today when it comes down to tactics. Things have advanced slightly a little bit with insider threat. That's where you compromise someone else's computer that then connects to that network that you're trying to compromise itself, that then can reach out from that IP address to get that information, or even a modem. So the tactics and strategies haven't changed very much, but then also the aging power infrastructure was built back in 1983, and it could be still connected the same way, especially in smaller municipalities or either rural, or just didn't have the budget to upgrade the systems. Sometimes it's a low priority where someone doesn't think it's a risk and say, well, we haven't had this problem before, so why fix it? And why is it a concern? And I think
So
that's Mhm.
who hacked the Venezuelan power grid? Was it a group of random teenagers in a basement? Was it something more organized? Was it a singular entity? Was it multiple? Um, what actually happened there? And what
So
is the media not reporting?
So that was my first concern when I saw the attacks on Venezuela, was the power going out. And the thing is, the reason why that's a concern is because, yeah, like if this was a tactical operation in Venezuela, like you're not going to call some teenagers in a garage somewhere to be like, hey, can you turn off the power? Or you're not going to have people that are compromised at the power plant turning switches off, because that's not done anymore. It's all through computers and PLC systems. I believe that their power grid was compromised. And keep in mind, Venezuela's power grid uses the same technology as our power grid. It's the same systems, the same PLCs. There's only a handful of manufacturers that create these systems. It's not like there's anything special proprietary about Venezuela's power versus our power, because they do probably sell their power to other countries nearby and whatnot. So my belief, once I saw that, it was a concern because it opens up Pandora's box again on Stuxnet. Because basically, in order for an attack to be on a power grid timed to where the power went off at this specific moment, and not to be days in advance, but to be within minutes or hours of advance of attack, that tells me right there that their systems were compromised and that there's something, maybe a Stuxnet 2.0. It could be something, but the problem and concern I have with that well, let me answer your question was, no, I don't believe it was a group of hackers. This had to been top secret. It had to been, to be so precise on that though, it had to been either a worm or a virus, or their systems were actively in their systems. And this isn't something that just happens with a phone call. This is something where those systems had to been compromised for weeks or years in advance.
And you're saying, so this is not hacking, this is US cyber warfare. Are you suggesting that the United States was the one who played the role in this? That it was the US government, their so quote like war games, and this is what AI is in 2026. This is how we conduct wars and maybe regime changes or countries and captures of dictators. This is how we're moving forward.
I believe so. I don't think it could have been just the United States. It could have been allies with the United States that collectively worked together on this. So I think that, yes, this is cyber warfare being used, and I think it's my concern is mostly we've opened up Pandora's box on this,
Mm-hmm.
So now usually if those systems were compromised through, let's say, a Stuxnet, someone's going to try to reverse engineer it, and they could possibly use it against our systems because, like I said, we have the same systems.
Kellen, what would you have to say to that? Would you agree that this is something, this is the 21st century, more, a quarter in to the 21st century? Is this how we're conducting our quote unquote war games?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the perfect storm, for anybody looking to do a quick operation or to have a very smooth war, right? You don't have to, because in order for, military or a regime to survive, you need to have the people who feed in to support it. So we have this idea, total war, where you strike at the people and the whole thing falls down. That's why, even though, you have all these international rules against civilian targets, Russians, they'll go for civilian targets. Israelis, they'll go for civilian targets because that's what works in warfare. With this, though, we were able, when we went into Venezuela, to prevent them being able to defend themselves at all, right? Their air defense systems, they weren't working. Communications, like, virtual communications, they weren't working. They were essentially dead in the water while, we did our thing and got out. And I do believe this is entirely how things will go in the future. I remember I was having this conversation with a spy recruiter of an unknown name who came to the University of Central Florida. And, we were talking about, all these, how this war of information, how everybody's trying to get some information on everybody else. And that, instead of mutually assured destruction, just being, I have a nuke and you have a nuke, it's now who controls whose information and who can sabotage whose infrastructure. Again, it's your fresh water, it's your power. It really is, because it's every part of civilian life, and government and military life. And you can sabotage it all in one fell swoop if you get in there correctly. I think as far as, when we look at defense in the future, it's not just going to be bombs. It's not just going to be tanks and guns and infantry. It's going to be, how can we defend our infrastructure from cyber attacks?
I definitely would agree with that. Steve, would you say that does this pose a threat? I mean, would the use of AI is it more negative, more positive, net neutral? I mean, or where is this something that's going to help advance U.S. interests, or could there be a possibility when we have our systems and then we're using that, and if they could be compromised by another country, if for example, our systems are not as secure, and as you said, smaller municipalities may not have the expertise and staff to make sure these utilities aren't openly connected to the internet. So, you know, is there security in how we conduct these games?
Yeah, when it comes to AI, for sure, that I believe I'm very strong that there's a lot of war games happening with AI, and and whatever technology is at the consumer grade right now or access, our government's definitely far more advanced on that. It's usually whatever the consumer gets. That's usually the breadcrumbs. Not the meat and potatoes of what the government's capable of. And I believe that, yeah, I don't think it was hackers. I think it was AI that. It's a good point. That could have triggered this to be so because you got to think about how many people have to be coordinated, even from an IT perspective, and then you have the physical side and all this. Or you could have an AI that's given these commands. But yeah, I think when it comes to the smaller municipalities and securing themselves, I think that's where when the government opens up Pandora's box on this, they need to increase those defenses. I mean, defensing, right now when it comes to IT systems, there's so many different contractors and rules, and there's not like a central audit, so to speak, to making sure that, hey, this guidance is being followed. Or, you got to remember the people that work on these systems are, the screwdrivers and wrenches people, and they don't know, hey, if I plug this into the internet, yeah, it's a quick solution to get our systems and power back online, but then they could be opening the door to something more adverse or high risk, not knowing that because they just are not aware. And so, increasing the security on the power grid, and not just that, just municipalities, and giving them the resources, and having experts come in and making sure that these systems are connected properly. It's not just from a logical standpoint, it's from a physical standpoint, making sure there aren't egresses or backdoors or anything to these networks. But I think also it's a cost. There's a cost to this. It's a cost of upgrading these systems. Not everybody can afford that. So
Yeah, and so I would like to get into those systems specifically here in Orlando. Before I get to that, I wanted to ask both of you guys. We've mentioned the term war games. Is games even the correct, or should it be the terminology here? I know it's quote, and this is nothing that is actually official. But we're playing possibly with people's lives. And now, so when we look at Venezuela, it was pretty seamless, right? It was very tactful, and it went very smoothly. Whether you agree with the capture or not, you can argue. It went very smoothly. There were no reported deaths there. When we look at that, is this something that we should just be light about? Is this something to take more seriously? And also, to both of you, Steve, you were mentioning the systems and the resources and, the funding we need for this. Is this something that we should, you said it was top secret, possibly. Should we keep it a secret, or should we have a national discussion on this? Because as we were talking about, we don't really see this conversation in the mainstream media. This is something new to me. And something I haven't really considered. So should we be opening the conversation, nationally, and sort of have lobbying for funding for this, if this is the future? And again, is games even the appropriate term here? So I'd ask Kellen what you think on that, and then first you respond.
Yeah, I think cyber warfare is a perfectly good term. And yeah, this is something that I think we need to have a discussion about, because this was news to a lot of us here in the States. It was news to the people of Venezuela. It was news to the world when that happened, but it wasn't news to many foreign governments, I would suspect. I would be amazed if this was news to the Chinese Communist Party. I'd be amazed if this was news to many of our closest allies, because the governments, this has been an arms race they've been involved with for at least a decade at this point. And we think about cutting the power grid in Caracas, right? Let's dial back over here to the U.S. Our power grid is fragmented. I mean, that was this came up recently, just a few years ago, when Texas had that snowstorm that knocked out their power grid, right? The rest of the states, we couldn't get power there because our grids weren't even connected, right? They had their own kind of grid. And so you have these three separate systems in the US, and they struggle to communicate with each other. And also think about rural areas, right? The US is a huge place. And going back to looking at what the template and goals of the Build Back Better Act were, a lot of what was found ahead of time was that a lot of smaller communities, they were just not updating their infrastructure anymore because they just weren't able to get up the money for it, and it was posing a lot of risks. And power systems, that were bleeding out electricity and raising costs, were on the list. Municipal water systems, whose technology and controls were aging, were on the list. These were problems that were coming up before. And how we modernize the systems, but also defend ourselves, needs to be, I think at least, a cornerstone of, when we talk about defense going forward. When 2028 comes and there's a new debate between two candidates, that should be on the minds of everybody watching and be on the minds of the candidates as well. How are we going to defend ourselves against this? Because, again, it was news to us, the general public. I would be amazed if it was news to many foreign governments who, would be the people who theoretically use it against us.
And you made a good point too, is like the grid and how it's segmented in those areas. But your security on the grid is only good as your weakest link, and that's why I brought up the rural areas. So, for example, like in Orlando, they're probably going to have for the power grid here the utmost security. But then you have private entities that are connected into the power grid, such as Disney World. They have a power plant there, connects into the grid. They sell power back. And then we're getting these solar systems and things that are connecting in on private systems. And then you'll have a rural system connected. But they all connect back to these big cities like Tampa, Orlando, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Jacksonville. So your security is only good as your weakest link, right? So it just takes one of these rural areas that doesn't have the budget or funding to secure their infrastructure, compromise that, and you get in there. That could have been the strategy for Venezuela. We don't know, but when it comes to the secrets and it comes to should it be talked about, I believe that the state secrets and how this was done in Venezuela needs to be top secret. This is not something that should be disclosed. The strategy, how it was done, where it was used, that could be used against us. That's like, for example, Snowden. He exposed a lot of state secrets on, spying on Americans and things. And I have my opinions. I'd rather not get into them. But, was it a positive? I don't think it was. I think it's like, well, did we need to know like some things? But then it's like how it was done. I don't know. That's a whole opinion of mine. Right. But now that the cat's out of the bag, I mean, I know it's saying hackers did this. I mean, if anyone with IT background and security would know, it wasn't a group of kids in a garage. You know what I mean? It had to have been a lot bigger than that and a lot more organized. And now the cat's out of the bag. So that brings the point up, should it be talked about? Yes. Not the methods and strategies, but it should be brought to awareness for sure that now that that's done and everybody knows and the world knows that was done, the world knows there was cyber warfare used as a tool to make the mission successful. Now that that's out of the bag, I think that industrial control systems, anything that impacts the life or safety of Americans, they need to be buttoned up and good, because we could get it dished back to us. It's happened in the past. It was covered up for a brief moment, but then it was disclosed with the power outage in New York in the early 2000s, or we were all told it was sagging power lines. No, it wasn't sagging power lines. It was, the grid was compromised. It was a data breach.
Steve, I wanted to ask you, and this relates to what you were saying, sorry to cut you off, but regarding the Panama Canal and their IT, with their infrastructure security. We're talking about security. Can you give me some insight there and how that can sort of serve as an example? The Panama Canal is so crucial, internationally for our hemispheres and trade. And just give me what's going on there. Do you have any knowledge on that?
Yeah, so the Panama Canal, a lot of people think that it's used for trade and shipping and things of that nature, but really their biggest revenue driver is power and electricity. A lot of their systems are running on DOS, Windows 95, like our systems actually do. Our power grid systems still run on old Microsoft Windows 95, 98, XP, outdated systems. And it costs a lot of money to upgrade those systems. And it's not just money, it's the coordination you have to reprogram those PLCs and replace them. And the cost it would be to create a power outage or downtime is so astronomical, or impact to people's lives. It's so risky for them. It's not just a cost, but it's a risk. Do you do it or you not do it? So there hasn't been a proper strategy. So I spoke to the IT director of the Panama Canal in San Francisco at a security conference, and he showed pictures of the system, and they're in the middle of a massive upgrade. Well, that was close to 10 years ago. So that upgrade, IT advances every 4 years, less than 4 years. So those systems that were upgraded, close to 10 years ago are now outdated, or they could be compromised. It just comes down to, that there has to be a proper strategy within that market. And then there has to be some sort of legislation that says, hey, if there's any industrial system out there that is connected to an internet or a network that has access to the internet or to the outside world that's not air gapped, they need to have, a plan to make sure that those systems are able to be upgraded or maintained, and they're checked, and that they are inspected and audited to make sure that there are no gaps. The Panama Canal, it's a good point, because people think that those systems should be, with the amount of money they generate, should be the best and out there in the market, but they weren't, and that was part of the awareness, is like, oh, well, our systems can't really, if they make all that revenue and they have it's supposed to be the best of the best when it comes down to and they're making their money from there, they should have the best of the best, where we should have the same, but we really don't. And that's the concern.
Kellen, the New York Times says the US used cyber weapons to leave millions in the dark to facilitate this capture of Maduro. Is this a cleaner way to handle regime change, or are we setting a dangerous precedent where civilians are the primary targets of code-based warfare? And to Steve's point, what is the risk here in security?
Yeah, again, it was kind of finally got articulated all the way back in the 1860s that there's a pyramid type hierarchy. You got your civilians, your citizens, then you have your kind of military, and at the top you have the leadership of it all. But if you strike at the bottom, you strike down the whole thing. And that is the way that modern warfare is done. This is what you saw, in the world wars. This is what you saw in all of our police actions. Put some quotes there. Following that, that's kind of how it has gone ever since, right? It's about how can you make citizens no longer support their own government unless it surrenders, right? What can be appreciated for sure about this kind of cyber approach is, one, this happened while in the middle of the night, right? Most people are asleep. They didn't even notice it happen until they woke up and discovered that their regime was collapsed. But also, again, it prevented armed conflict. When you deactivate the military communications, you deactivate the air defense systems. There's a reason why lives weren't really being lost much in this conflict, because the ability to actually engage in a fight was taken down. Now, again, that only sounds like a positive. When you're the one dealing the damage and the people receiving it didn't support the leader anyways. It's another thing entirely when we're discussing, two groups of people firing back at each other and citizens receiving, this huge brunt. Because again, I think back to rural areas often because, I'm originally from Idaho and from Utah and whatnot. There's a lot of rural areas out there. Getting supplies and getting anything, even something as simple as mail to those areas is really difficult as it is. How you supply an area like that without working infrastructure, that is a real concern, I think, in this country.
And talking about concern, to both of you, we're talking about the ICS systems in Orlando. Steve, are we at risk in Orlando? I think, the water, power, traffic, even our fridges. Are we at risk? Are we safe here?
Well, the answer to when it comes to those systems and IT security, nothing is 100% secure. The folks that operate those systems should have a risk assessment done, and then it's up to the CEOs and the executives to do the risk acceptance. So there's risk. There's always risk. Nothing's 100%. The Iranian centrifuge was an air gap system at one point, and that's supposed to be the most secure method in IT security, but then you have to have operations, you have to have functionality. So when it comes down to the risk, I don't know the exact risk, but I would say that yes, we're always at risk, but then the public though really, I don't even know if the executives really know the true risk. I mean, no one really knows unless it's being talked about internally within their organization to say and ask the right questions. What is the risk? What is our, have we done a risk assessment, and have we done it from a third party, and have we done it from multiple third parties? Because if you're doing a risk assessment internally, you're going to probably have a bias. There's local companies here that do it, like Fortress Security there in downtown Orlando. There's a lot of consulting firms that are out there that do risk assessments, and it's always good to have multiple opinions. So that's my opinion, but not everybody can afford that. Like Orlando could, but then we don't get all our power from Orlando. Is Disney doing that?
Yeah, that raises a great point. Kellen, would you agree? Would you disagree? What's, based on our conversation, are we at risk? And, with elections coming up in Orlando, as we were talking about, should this be something that is brought to the forefront of Central Florida politics?
I'm not quite sure about that, to be honest, because the fact of the matter is, while of course we have, energy being generated here via solar panels, via natural gas and others, solar natural gas being your main source of electricity around here, we're also connected to FPL, right? And like Steve said, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And our weakest link may not be in Orlando at all. It may be well outside of Orlando, but we can still feel the pain over here because the grid is connected. So there's the potential of wrecking far more outside of the weakest link. Maybe the weakest link is like some rural area down south, or maybe it's like Lake County or something like that. But if the system is compromised enough, that can still leak. That can still leak down and hit us over here, no matter how well prepared we are. Or maybe it is contained, but we still end up sending power, and naturally that's a strain on us. I think what we really need to look at is the state. The state of Florida, I think, is the people I think are the most qualified to deal with this issue and to really kind of take the lead, set standards, and figure out what our plan is. Because again, the weakest link could be anywhere in the state, but if FPL is secure, then we're all better off, much better off than if just Orlando is secure, just Orange County is secure, I think.
We can't talk about cyber warfare or cyber war without talking about Iran, the birthplace of the original Stuxnet awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in 2026, we see a silicon and crude war. The U.S. is squeezing Iranian and Venezuelan oil to prevent China from using cheap energy to power their AI data centers. So, to both of you, the Trump administration's stance is clear. Energy dominance equals AI dominance. And so if we cut off the oil, we slow China's servers. Is this the ultimate America First strategy, or is the president playing a global game of war games that could lead to a hot conflict? Kellen.
Mhm. Yeah, as far as AI dominance goes, and as far as what the needs are for U.S. versus China, the actual needs and challenges of AI data centers in both countries are very different to each other. China has a newer power grid. Their power grid was built later than ours, runs on newer systems. It's more efficient. Stuff can travel a longer distance, and it's unified. They also have a really high reserve requirement. Our reserve requirement here in the U.S. is really low. It's a couple percent. Over there in China, it's north of 10%. And reserve requirement is just how much excess energy you're required to store. So for every 9 watts that's sent out in China, 1 is put in storage. And so when the this AI boom came, they had the energy stored up, right? And those reserves will still run them for quite a long time. They have time to get their game together and then get back to where they want it to be. But also, if you look at the energy composition in China, it's no secret that they are looking to expand their oil because they're primarily powered by coal still. But coal plants maintenance sucks at coal plants. Nobody they don't want to hold those if they can, so they're thinking maybe convert some of these to oil and switch it up. I would say if we're talking whether or not this who this really affects, I would say this affects us more than it affects China because China doesn't import a lot from Venezuela anyways. They weren't moving to import a lot from Venezuela, and they've been moving away from Iran recently anyways. They've been securing it elsewhere. I mean, I appreciate the thought, but it's ultimately not going to affect China that much. What it does affect is us potentially, because as far as tapping Venezuelan oil reserves go, because they have the biggest oil reserves in the world, but getting those secured and tapped is going to be a challenge. And this is something we've been seeing the administration go round and around, trying to throw around ideas, try to figure out how we're going to secure these things. Because it's going to take probably upwards, estimates show, it's going to take about a decade to get all the infrastructure Venezuela needs fully online to fully tap those reserves. 10 years, that's a long time. We don't know where the AI race is. We don't know what AI is going to be like in 10 years. A couple of years ago, we didn't know where it was going to be like now. And it is quite different now, I think, than we envisioned. I don't think this will move the needle tremendously, either against China or for us. But it definitely does, as far as America, if you're going for like an America First type angle, it does put potential security in oil power if that's something that you think is viable for the U.S. in the future.
Steve, do you have a response?
I have a pretty simple one, actually. It doesn't impact us because as long as the data center is connected on the internet, it can be anywhere in the world. So if the data center, if you put it in the Netherlands or you put it in the UK or Greenland or somewhere, it'll use those power resources there. So the data center for AI, data centers where AI is housed, what causes the power consumption and energy consumption is mostly the cooling and as well as the server's processing power is what uses, and then it generates heat, which requires cooling. So yeah, you could just build your data center in another country or somewhere. So if you have an energy issue here, build it somewhere else and then connect it to the internet.
Steve, in the age of AI, is it even possible for the US to keep its state secrets secure when the very sensors in our homes, IoT, the Internet of Things, are a part of the global grid?
I mean, that's actually a good point. So can you that goes back into the private thing. So let's say our energy sector is secure and we have no concerns there. Well, if you own a modern day refrigerator or microwave even, or dishwashers and laundry, dryers or anything, they connect through Wi-Fi and they connect to the internet, and then they all go to a main server. So for GE, they have one server that everything pretty much connects to, or multiple servers through load balancing. I don't want to get technical, but basically, essentially, one entity controls a product. Now, imagine GE getting hacked, and then somehow someone turns off all the GE refrigerators in the United States. What kind of impact could that have on our food supply? What kind of impact could that have for people in general, or commercial cooling systems. Like even the restaurants downtown Orlando, they have telemetry devices connected to those coolers and freezers, and can control the cooler or freezer or change the temperature, turn it on or off. So it is a concern with that, making sure that those private entities are doing, right now it's probably not regulated at all like a power plant is, but there's no real true regulation on that. So there is a concern there. So IoT systems also provide a lot of data. So whether someone's home or not, they can detect presence. They can tell how many times you open the fridge door, so they can detect your eating habits, and you connect that all to AI, or what temperature your house is at, or even your cell phone. It's got AI on it. And let's say that gets compromised, and you could get a lot of information on someone and their behavior, whether they're in a bad mood or a good mood. Someone might eat more if they're in a bad mood, so I think it's all related to where. What was your question again? I'm sorry. I was trying to get the.
Well, and you're talking about it. So we're talking about what's in our very own lives, our homes, consumer products. How is this part of the global grid? And you're talking about the risk. AI can detect this. They can even monitor our food habits, our eating habits, perhaps. When we're talking about what's going on within our own homes, how can that translate to the global security, the global grid?
Yeah, it's all connected. It's a good point you make, because it's all connected. All these things, from the refrigerators to the microwaves to dishwashers, doing laundry, and you can build a behavior profile. And then, it's all connected to private grids, and I don't think those are regulated. But if you compromise those, you could create a panic. You can impact the supply chain for food, retail, anything. So that even now your car, every vehicle that's pretty much modern has a cellular device in it. It's connected to the internet some way, shape, or form. And someone hacks Tesla and shuts off every Tesla in the United States. What happens? Actually, I think there was a movie that kind of had that in there, but it's not just Teslas, gas-powered vehicles. Everyone thinks, oh, the Teslas are the only things connected to the internet. No, your Audis are, your German vehicles, your American vehicles, Chinese vehicles, Japanese vehicles, they're all connected to the internet, one shape or form.
Yes, and I think that movie you were referring to, I don't recall the name, I believe maybe Sandra Bullock, or what was the actress? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But my point being is that with that movie, they were able to take hold of the power grid, and that was within the United States. Everything shut down, and it sort of ended up in this social and moral frenzy. A lot of people were at risk. I would have to get that name. Maybe we can add a post-production. And then, Steve, when we're talking about the network of physical objects, can AI now poison training data or act without human intervention to trigger defensive, offensive measures?
That's a good question. I can't answer that, but with fact, but I can give my opinion, and it comes back to your opening with war games with the Whopper. That was the name of the computer, the War Operations computer, where it acted like an AI. Joshua was the name of him, but then the developer programmed him. So you have to understand that whoever's programming it, could program it to, I don't know, down to the programming of AI, but it's a program, and that's what the whole war games was. Well, he's programmed to do this. The Whopper was programmed to create war games and simulations to see, if this happened or that happened, what would be the result? Who wins? And the end result was no one wins, which is, no one ever wins, but we move on. But the thing is, can AI make decisions? I mean, that goes back to the movie Terminator. I think personally, my opinion is yes. I hope we haven't let it do that. I hope we haven't let it, like, that's what the whole concern was in war games. They removed the humans out of the missile silos and they put in the secure code generators, and the Whopper was trying to guess the launch codes, and it did. So what safety mechanisms are being put in place? Those are questions that need to be asked, but then it's like, it needs to be private, and hopefully they're being asked. But I wouldn't want that to be public to say, hey, yeah, our missile silos are 100% controlled by AI. Would you be able to sleep at night?
I agree. And I'm gonna open this question, Kellen, before we move on to discuss Greenland. I know you're very excited about that. We're talking a lot about movies, actually, and this point just came to me. The movie that Steve was referring to with Tesla that I was trying to think of is called Leave the World Behind, starring Julia Roberts.
Yes.
Pretty Woman, that was the actress there. When I talk about movies, and this is a question to you, if you've ever heard of the term predictive programming, where they, the government, entertainment industries, they use media to sort of signal and sort of get the general public a very slow but meticulous way, sort of covertly, subtly, but also in our face through media to get us ready for these new technologies and to usher in a new era. We have mentioned War Games in 1983, Terminator, another one, and then Leave the World Behind, a movie just from recent years. Would you say that the government, and entertainment industries, they have these, and we're talking about secrets, they have these secrets in reserve, and that, any time now it's going to just blow up in our face, as we've seen from media spanning back decades?
Again, I hope our government isn't just giving it away for free to people to make movies of it. But there's always potential for it to blow up in your face, especially if you're not prepared for it. Like, something that was on my mind recently was kill switches. Steve was bringing up Teslas, but technically, right now the government has been really, this kind of showed back up in the media because Congress chose not to stop this program. But the U.S. government wants government-controlled kill switches in every car to get traffic violators. So if the computer thinks that you violated your traffic one too many times, they just cut your car, and it goes and it's just bricked. And that's been something the government's been pursuing since 2021. And it was something that was under the Biden administration, but is being continued under the current administration. And one of my thoughts was, man, imagine if that system got compromised. Just kill switch every car, just every newish car in the country. That would be, kind of disastrous. And I think, and it's, in many ways, I can imagine a government, really appreciating the idea of having, all access and control to all these different systems. But in some cases, it may be prudent to have more limited access, given, these cyber threats. The fewer people have access, the fewer people it's likely to screw up or create a security breach. And yeah, as far as informing the public, a lot of times governments like to introduce stuff slowly, and not usually all at once, but sometimes they do. I don't know how much of an intentional effort there is right now, whether there's any connections between these threads as to like some way to inform the public. I won't pretend to know. Maybe we'll see in the future and look back and we'll say yes or no.
I think it's an interesting thought, talking about, Venezuela, Iran, and now Greenland, how they seem so far away, different continents, but they all really relate, and the world is this ushering in an era of globalism. I don't know. Finally, the Arctic, last week in Davos, President Trump pivoted from military force and tariffs to a shared sovereignty framework with Denmark. Conservatives see this as securing $50 trillion in rare earth minerals for our AI hardware. Liberals see it as an imperialist land grab that threatens the environment. Kellen, is shared sovereignty a brilliant diplomatic workaround, Or is this just a compact of free association that effectively puts Greenland under US control?
It does seem to me that the administration ultimately wants control over Greenland. And at least we've ruled out military force. And honestly, probably should never have been brought up because you don't want to sever all your ties with the number one importer of American goods and our closest military allies, among other things. As far as shared sovereignty goes, I'm not sure how that works. I don't think I found. I wasn't looking. I'm not really properly found a really good model of this. Again, the closest thing would be, the contract of free associations that we have with Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. But I don't think those are really quite the same thing, because when we're looking at, what's this interest being touted by the administration in Greenland? Why do they care about the big block of ice? Again, it's the rare earth metals, and it's, and of course, also the idea of data centers. That's something that's been brought. Hey, if you put it in Greenland, imagine how much cheaper the cooling could be, because the air outside is already like oppressively cold. Now, $50 trillion of rare earth metals. It's important to note that's the amount as it would be right now, right? That's the valuation. But extracting that is a real right pain. Like Antarctica, for example, it's the biggest place you'll find coal and oil. But there's a reason we don't drill there. It's the same reason, even though now you can drill in Alaska, no American company has opted to do it. It is really, really expensive. And anything that isn't like around the coast, right? Anything that isn't directly around the coast, which is most of it, is very difficult to access. So it is a little unclear how much there would get. And as far as like shared sovereignty goes, I mean, we'll have to see what Denmark's interest would be in that. Maybe it's just that we have more access to infrastructure. It could be smart, or it could just be kind of a nothing burger.
We were talking about models, and I know it's so there's one out there, the Diego Garcia model. This approach could give the U.S. the operational control needed for defense without undermining Danish or Greenlandic sovereignty. Again, it's up in the air to see where this actually goes. With a little context, Diego Garcia is located in the Indian Ocean, heavily regulated, heavily vegetated atoll, a little island functioning as a joint UK-US military base since the 1970s. The purpose behind it was, this approach, now aimed at Greenland, focuses on securing critical Arctic areas to counter rival influences, just as Diego Garcia functions as a defensive node for the Indo-Pacific. Trump's making the argument with Greenland's in such a crucial, critical area in the Arctic.
For Russia's
threats, the tension between NATO and Greenland's desire for independence, does that, outweigh our own foreign, interests here at home? As Americans, should our main concern be the United States? I mean, that sounds most obvious, but then you also have to factor in everything else. I was going to ask to both of you, and first back to Kellen, so you can respond to what I was just saying. But looking at public sentiment, it is split. 74% of Americans oppose unilateral military force abroad, yet 80% of Republicans support strikes against cartels or adversaries in our hemisphere. How does the Trump administration balance this reckless peacemaker image? He has brokered, I think close to 7, 8 peace deals. He is, the peace president, but then, others will argue, well, you're disrupting the whole balance here. And again, to the model I pointed out, is this in U.S. interest? What's the sentiment that you're feeling?
Sure. If you don't want the image of being, kind of reckless and, like excessively reckless, then don't feed ultimately into the narrative. It's one thing to talk about policy, right? You say like, hey, as a matter of defense, we think that even though we have some bases in Greenland, we think that some of the lines of shipping are still compromised, because when they're talking security, that's the crux of it, is that, stuff could get smuggled or snuck in past the defenses that are there in these little blind spots. And then that could be an asset specifically for Russia. And look top down, that's kind of why NATO is the way that it is because it surrounds the Arctic, which, cages in Russia. That's kind of the idea there. It's one thing to talk about that issue. But it's another thing to communicate, more like the image of it, right? It's about, it's awesome to take Greenland, or sending inflammatory statements and letters to foreign governments if they don't agree to a policy that wasn't really intensely discussed much before those letters were sent, right? If you start a conversation off on the wrong foot, it's good that the wrong foot's where it's going to be on that whole entire time. And I think that was ultimately what happened here. I think the administration got really ahead of itself in terms of how it wished to communicate this issue. Because it's one thing to work with your allies, maybe seek to, focus on Greenland and do some new things. It's another thing to go straight for we got to get up in arms about this, especially with our closest allies. Because if we're talking about defending, the United States, Europe is a big part of that. Because again, the two countries we often find ourselves defending ourselves against are China and Russia. And which alliance keeps Russia at bay? NATO. So you do need the relations with NATO, and you need to keep that alliance strong if you want to keep Americans safe from that particular threat. I think it's no confusion why the American public was put off by the way this was communicated.
Steve, you can respond to that point. If you can, however, tie in again how AI may be able to predict public sentiment, and then to bring that back to our previous discussion with Venezuela, then Iran, now Greenland, how the public sentiment may have been predicted and tracked by AI for the benefit of the United States.
Yeah. I'm without answering with a political bias. I'm just in general for an IT AI perspective. I believe that this technology has been out for multiple years. We had back in our corporate world. So, like for example, there's something called a SIM, which basically is the black box of a company's data center or the heart of their company that records everything you do on your computer. It sees if you're on Facebook, it knows everything, and it just collects that data. And it's useless unless you add on back in the mid 2010s was something called UEBA, which is a user entity behavioral analytic engine, which was an algorithm that then would detect if an employee it's more for HR, but also used for IT security to detect insider threat, to see if someone's unhappy, if they're, happy, not happy, things like that. And I believe that's advanced into AI, which then back to your point about do these movies, are they released to see what the sentiment is on the public and what the reaction is and try to get a poll or, a temperature on things? I think it's all relevant and possible. That's my opinion. And mixed with AI from these older algorithms that then now it's an AI engine, a single engine that then can determine what is the political heat, but is also monitoring every politician's Facebook, what they say, what people are posting on Facebook, from the citizens' viewpoint. And then, if you have that into a you would need a very large, powerful computer to process all this. The data is already collected. That's what Snowden exposed. Like even all the metadata, even the conversation we're having now, it's been converted to metadata. And it's collected and it's just stored. But then there has to be an engine that has to process that. And then if the government's using an AI engine, it has to use a lot of power to process all this data. And then back to the Whopper and War Games, processes it and sees the sentiment of the civilians in all the other countries, what their viewpoints are and where they're going to get a win out of. I believe it was tested prior, but I think I believe the big test was Venezuela. I think, I think it was possibly used there. And then maybe that's like Greenland came out of left field, in my opinion, without a political bias. So then, but I'm hearing or seeing on the news is, well, national security is the biggest justifier. Well, what if the AI is being used and is doing all the sentiment processing and has said, oh, we do have a security threat because it detected something or it sees something, a pattern's change, something's changing, and is it important? Is the Greenland thing really a political thing, a stunt, or is it the sidetrack, or is it really a serious issue? So I don't think we'll really, especially with Venezuela, we won't know these things until years on out. The truth always comes out. Like Stuxnet took like a decade to come out. I mean, and Stuxnet was a 0-day virus. It was undetected for years and years and years. There's a movie 0 Days that's about it, or a documentary really. It's good to watch, but I think, what if AI is a 0-day itself, or what if we developed a 0-day? And that's what Terminator is about, is that the AI in Terminator was a 0-day itself, infected everyone's refrigerators and infected all the IoT systems, ICS systems, and instantly shut everything off and took over humanity.
My takeaway here is that, this is not hacking. This is U.S. cyber warfare, and the media is reporting it otherwise as hackers, like a third party. And the cyber warfare aspect is not being discussed. And I think it is, super important that these conversations that we're having are had, because, a lot of people don't think of this, or, look to AI as an entity that could be used either for our benefit or detriment. As we've seen today, the war games are no longer just on the screen, from the power grids of Caracas to the service in Tehran and the minerals in Greenland. The world is being rewritten in real time. To navigate this, you need more than just information. You need a platform that values sovereignty. That is the mission of the King Exchange. And that is why we are proud to partner with J&Washington's T8020 token and exchange. In a world where the state can turn off the power or freeze the markets, the T8020 at j-washington.com/T8020 provides a decentralized path for your assets. Don't be a pawn in the global game. Be the player who controls the exchange. Okay, so I think we've had such an insightful conversation today. A lot of information, a lot of expertise. I would like to give you guys about a minute for just any closing thoughts and remarks. And I would again like to thank you both for joining us here today on the first episode of the King Exchange. And we'll start with Kellen.
Yeah. For one, thank you, Steve, for coming. Your expertise, your insight has been invaluable for this. So thank you so very much. This has been amazing. And yeah, the takeaway is that, it's not a dude in a basement anymore. These, it's organized governments, in militaries that are now the threat, to anything cyber in this country and anywhere else, really. I agree with Steve that, we need to keep how we actually do anything as top secret as we possibly can. You don't want to give that away. We don't want to pull everything out of the box right out the gate. But we do need to have a discussion about how we're going to defend ourselves and what we're going to do in case of a successful cyber attack. It's important to plan for these scenarios because back in the day it was nuclear bombs. Today it's the infrastructure getting shut down remotely. And we need to have that conversation, and we need to plan for that.
Steve?
Yep, I agree. I think that, in short, AI, a lot of people fear it, should fear it, but you should embrace it. And then it just needs to be tactful on how we use it, and making sure that we are aware and we have the defenses there. And then also keep in mind, this isn't something that just popped up in the past couple of years or 5 years. This is something that's been in the works for with technology for well over a decade. So I just think it's now the awareness needs to be brought up to everyone, from the private sector to the public sector. And I'm just hoping that, now that Pandora's box is open, that we are secure.
But with measure, of course. Steve, Kellen, thank you so much. This is Sean, and we'll see you next time on the King Exchange.
All right, thank you.